And you are podcasting with Gary DeMar. Let's figure things out.
I'm Gary DeMar, and this is Bible Prophecy Under the Microscope. And in this episode, I want to deal with some surprising facts from the book of Revelation. And just the other day, I received a phone call from someone who years ago was teaching on the book of Revelation from a Bible study that Kay Arthur had put together. And one of the things he was going to do as he was preparing for this study of Revelation was to go kind of look and find additional sources to supplement what he was finding in Kay Arthur's study of Revelation. Now, Kay Arthur's pretty famous Bible study student, as well as having many churches, so she has a curriculum. Anyway, in the process of him doing this kind of extra study, he came across a book that I had written called Last Days Madness. And when he had read my book, and while I don't deal in detail with the book of Revelation, the fundamentals, the principles of Bible interpretation related to Bible prophecy were enough to have him question what he was reading in Kay Arthur's study of Revelation. Now, Kay Arthur's study of Revelation is fairly popular. There may be some differences among people who teach what she generally teaches, the operating assumptions she teaches, which I'm going to guess is mostly dispensational premillennialism. And so there's a lot of that out there. And anyone who's online will see this. I just saw something the other day from Dallas Theological Seminary that they're offering a course on the book of Revelation. There are numerous commentaries on the book of Revelation. And what I want to do is not to take time to go through the book of Revelation verse by verse by verse by verse. That has been done over and over and over again. I can make some recommendations. American Vision publishes a commentary on Revelation by David Chilton called Days of Vengeance, which is a verse-by-verse commentary on Revelation. He's also written a primer on Bible prophecy called Paradise Restored. Ken Gentry has a 2-volume commentary on Revelation, which is very good. I don't agree with every detail of it. That's the case of almost anything that anybody ever writes. It's very, very detailed, 2 volumes. Unfortunately, the 2 volumes are $100, but if you're really interested in a commentary on Revelation that's verse by verse, that would be the place to go. And Peter Leithart has a 2-volume commentary on Revelation as well. So there are, I would say, alternatives out there to the standard stuff that you find online. And I found over the years that new Christians often gravitate to the book of Revelation. And some of the reasons for this are that they may have heard a sermon or something on Facebook about how we are living in the last days. And as a result of that, they want to go to the book of Revelation, or they may want to go to chapters 38 and 39 from Ezekiel or Matthew 24. But I find that young people end up going to the book of Revelation, and this is going to tell them exactly what the end times are like. So they start reading Revelation and plug what they've heard or read into their interpretive framework. It becomes their interpretive framework. So they are going into the book of Revelation with the operating assumption that the book of Revelation is describing events in our future, things that have not happened yet. That's at least the case from chapters 4 through 19. And they do this with an interpretive framework without any consideration of the original audience and also the time indicators. So how would those who have first read what was sent to them by John, possibly copied by others and sent to these 7 churches, what would have been their view of what they were reading? Were they reading the book of Revelation, the scroll of Revelation, and seeing and hearing some people did not read, and so they were hearing or reading the book of Revelation, and they immediately assumed that what they were reading was about events in the distant future. So if a person begins reading a prophetic book with a belief that it's about the end times meaning something in the distant future and not having anything to do with their time, then everything in the book will be shoehorned into that belief. And look, to be honest with you, that's common with anybody. With my particular view on the book of Revelation, or David Chilton's, or Ken Gentry's, or Peter Lightheart's, or others, they're going to begin with a set of operating assumptions, and then when you start doing that, when you look at their operating assumptions, you're going to try to read the book in terms of that. You can't resist it. It's there. And so what I want to do is just kind of point out a few things that might help you understand things to look for in the book of Revelation that might put things in a different perspective for you. You don't need to understand all the details of what you're reading in Revelation. Those come later, but there are certain fundamentals you have to get. And so a lot of people who end up reading through Revelation, they may be unaware of how Revelation has been interpreted and applied to world conditions throughout history. Now, every generation that read the book of Revelation, and every commentator throughout history on the book of Revelation, you will find commentators who maintain that what they were reading in Revelation, those things were happening in their day. And they all have one thing in common, of course. They would be wrong because those things in the book of Revelation did not happen in their day. For example, the interpreters saw the rise of Islam as an end-time sign that the book of Revelation was all about. This is often attributed to the historicist perspective, interpretive perspective on Revelation, where the book of Revelation is the broad spectrum of prophetic history throughout time. And so the historicist finds in areas in the book of Revelation, this refers to the rise of Islam. This refers to the Roman Catholic Church. For the longest time, the Roman Catholic Church was considered the end-time bad guy. And in fact, the belief was so prominent that many of writers from the 15th century on said that's what the book of Revelation was all about, along with 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and other portions of Scripture. And in fact, the idea that the papacy was the Antichrist was written in the Westminster Confession of Faith, which was a 17th century document. It was later changed. This was not to say that because people's perspective on the Roman Catholic Church not being the end time Antichrist, man of lawlessness, etc., just because they don't necessarily believe that. They still have doctrinal problems with the Roman Catholic Church, as I do, although I don't believe that the book of Revelation is dealing with the Roman Catholic Church, and for a couple of obvious reasons. The same with 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. I have a book, Last Days Madness, where I have 2 chapters on 2 Thessalonians 2, and I deal with it in terms of the same types of things I'm going to discuss with you. Then you will find that the people who are reading Revelation for the first time, they're being told that it's the most literal book in the Bible. And now this all depends on your definition of what literal means. And for example, there's chapter 12, there's an image of a woman who is standing on the moon. She's draped with the sun and has 12 stars as a crown. And I'm thinking, well, what do you mean by literal there? This is a symbol of something, and that symbol is in fact literal. Whatever it represents, that's the literal thing. But no one that I know of is reading that and saying there's a giant woman out in space somewhere. So what does literal mean? It comes from a Latin word, which litera, and it means according to the literature. So when you read something in Scripture, you need to pay close attention to what type of literature is being used. There are all kinds of symbolic uses. There are similes and metaphors, hyperbole, and it's the Bible is filled with literature. And you need to be careful that when you read the scriptures, you've got to determine what type of literature is being used. Jesus used a lot of storytelling in there. So in one sense, everything is literal if you understand the type of literature you are reading. If not, then you might be plucking out your eyes, because in Matthew chapter 18, verse 9, Jesus said, if your eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out and throw it from you. It is better for you to enter life with one eye than to have two eyes and be cast into the fire, into fiery hell. So, Jesus is making a very drastic statement here, but he is not telling people to pluck out their eyes. And when Jesus, talks to Nicodemus, he says, "You must be born again." And Nicodemus, I'm going to have to get back in my mother's womb again. No. In the Samaritan woman, and in the next chapter, Jesus talks about living water. Well, she wants some of this living water. She's having to come to this well because of her sexual escapades, and she can't come when the general population comes, so he has to come kind of off hours, and she would like this new kind of water. And you begin to see that that there's the literature in the Bible is important to understand what's going on in the context. And this is no different in the book of Revelation. So back to my original statement, how would the first people who read Revelation have understood it? This is extremely important, because if you look at chapter 1, verse 3, it says, "Blessed is the one who reads and those who hear the words of the prophecy." So remember, the book of Revelation, if you look at chapters 2 and 3, were written to 7 churches that existed at that time. How would the people at that time have understood the book of Revelation? What the scroll of Revelation wasn't a book in the sense that we know today. Would they have understood it in a way different from the way we might understand it? And I would say absolutely yes. They were the primary audience. There's no indication in the early chapters of Revelation that there is some sort of postponement to the events of Revelation. Now, you might say, well, are you saying that this was fulfilled and that was fulfilled and that was fulfilled? I would say yes, if you understand the literature that was being used, and also understanding the audience relevance, to whom was this first addressed, and also to pay attention to time indicators. If you don't do that, then you can make the book of Revelation seem relevant to every era, and see its fulfillment based upon things that are unique to your era. But eras change, technology changes, and what the first readers of Revelation understood, something that Hal Lindsey wrote in his 1970 mega bestseller, The Late Great Planet Earth, where Lindsay says this about Revelation chapter 9, verses 1 through 12. And this 1970s is the era of the Vietnam War. And he writes about this. He says that he wrote, "I have a Christian friend," this is Lindsay speaking, who was a Green Beret in Vietnam. When he first read this chapter, he said, "I know what those are. I've seen hundreds of them in Vietnam. They're Cobra helicopters." Now, Lindsay goes on to say, now that may be conjecture, but it does give you something to think about. A Cobra helicopter does fit the sound of many chariots, which is what you find in Revelation chapter 9. My friend believes that the means of torment will be a kind of nerve gas sprayed from its tail. And so this particular comment was not from his Late Great Planet Earth. I think it was based upon some of his other prophecy books about the terminal generation, the 1980s, and how the 1980s were supposedly going to be the end, the fulfillment of the end time. So Hal Lindsey took current events and tried to make sense of the book of Revelation based on current events. And so he started looking for things that say, hey, this sounds like this today. This sounds like this today. This sounds like this today. But you can go all the way back to the 19th century, where in the book of Daniel it talks about the people will be going to and fro around the world, to and fro and to and fro. They would be going quickly here and quickly there. And this particular commentator said, well, this was describing railroads, because before that you had people on horseback, but now they're much, much faster, and that must have been the trains, the railroads. That's what Daniel was describing. That's what Daniel was seeing. Well, today we go much, much faster than that. So if you fall into the trap of trying to fit the book of Revelation into our era, then every era sees the fulfillment as their era, and they end up being wrong. And then people say, well, wait a minute, you said this was going to happen, this was going to happen, that didn't happen, and I'm not going to trust the Bible anymore. Now, the key to so much of what you find in the book of Revelation that helps us is, we saw, number one, the audience relevance. This was written to people who were alive then, and those people were to read it and hear it, and on the basis of that, to be able to figure out what it says. And you have those 7 churches. It was written to those 7 churches. And so the first audience must have believed that it had some relevance to their day. And why would God give this revelation to them if it didn't really apply to their day? In fact, if you look at the very first verse in Revelation, you will find that these things were soon to take place. And so here you are, somebody, a copy of the scroll, the Revelation, comes to you, and the minister, the elder in the church, stands up and he starts reading it, and people hear the word soon. This is soon going to take place. And they're thinking, well, that seems to refer to us. And then in the third verse, it says, because the time is near. So here you have in the first verse and the third verse of the first chapter dealing with a time element. Then you go to the last chapter of Revelation, and you find the same time words in Revelation chapter 22, verse 6, and Revelation chapter 22, verse 10, as well as Jesus saying he was coming quickly. Now we get to this idea. So we look at the audience, we look at the time indicators, and now we have to look at what coming means. And if you look at Revelation chapters 2 and 3, you will notice that Jesus threatens to come to some of those churches in judgment against those churches if they don't get their act together. So not every use of coming in Scripture refers to what most people would call the second coming. And that was the same in the Old Testament. You'll see a number of times in the Old Testament where God came in a particular way, came in judgment. Isaiah chapter 19, verse 1, you find that that God came on a swift cloud to Egypt, riding on a swift cloud to Egypt, and the idols trembled at his presence. You'll find Zephaniah where God came down. You find, of course, if you got Exodus chapter 19, that God came down. So you need to put all these in perspective here as to what's going on. Matthew chapter 24 is very important as well. Matthew 24, it's prophesied by Jesus himself that he was going to come in some way before that generation passed away. And you can see that in Matthew chapter 24, verse 30. And I'm not going to get into all the details of that. If you can see my book, Wars and Rumors of Wars and Last Days Madness, and Is Jesus Coming Soon, I discuss all of these things. So keep in mind that just because you see the word coming, and sometimes you don't know what the Greek word is behind it. Sometimes it's erkomai, and sometimes it's parousia, and they have distinct meanings. But oftentimes English translations don't let you know that which one is erkomai and which one is parousia. And so it does take a little bit of extra skill, extra study to get behind the English text and look at the Greek, and there are lots of places online where you can do that. I use Bible Hub, but there are others as well. And then there are mentions of beasts in Revelation chapter 13. And obviously these beasts represent something, so much so that what you find in Revelation chapter 14, the Lamb is mentioned. So the Lamb is mentioned and beasts are mentioned, and these are symbolic for something else. In Revelation chapter 13, there is a sea beast and a land beast. Many believe that the sea beast, again, keep in mind, first audience, who first heard this? What would they have thought? The sea beast would generally be Rome. Rome had dominance of the sea at that period of time. In fact, if you ever watch Ben-Hur, you'll see that the setting of that is when you find Judah Ben-Hur, sent to the galleys to row, that there's a huge sea battle, and that result of that sea battle, you had Rome, commanding the Mediterranean area there. So people would have thought Rome was dominating the sea. And then what about the land? Well, the land is most appropriately describing what we would say Israel. So you got the sea beast and the land beast kind of colluding against the person of the church. And you have the number 666 being used. What does that mean? And there have been numerous books trying to figure out what that meant. It's not 3 sixes. It's not 666. It is 666. And what would have been contemporary at that time where that number would mean something? And there are a lot of commentators who believe that the 666 refers to Nero or Neron Kaiser, the Nero Caesar. And if you take his name and put it in Hebrew letters, you will find that it adds up to 666. And in fact, there's coinage that have Nero Caesar, and you have coins that have Neron Caesar. And so some Revelation manuscripts have 616 and some have 666. One would apply to Nero Caesar, 616, and one would apply to Neron Caesar, 666. So these are some of the things that many people, when they go to the book of Revelation, aren't aware of, and they go with an already established interpretive paradigm that this is referring to something at the end of time. And one of the ways those who teach on this get around this, because they know chapters 2 and 3 refer to 7 churches that existed in Asia Minor at that time. And also in Revelation chapter 1, we find that John describes himself as a fellow partaker in the tribulation. So what happens is they put a gap at the end of the 3rd chapter and the beginning of the 4th chapter and say something like, well, the rapture of the church has taken place here. And so between the end of chapter 3 and the beginning of chapter 4, we have this gap in time of nearly 2,000 years, which is not any way to interpret the Bible to say, oh, I think I'm going to put a gap here in time, because it has to fit to make this futuristic. Chapter 4 follows chapter 3. I've already dealt with kind of the church idea being raptured in other places, and I deal with this also in my books, The Last Days Madness. So I just want to kind of give you a little heads up on some things you might not have been aware of regarding the book of Revelation. So be careful when you go and read it. Pay attention to the audience relevance. Pay attention to the time indicators. Pay attention to the symbols that are being used. Sometimes they're difficult to figure out. And it's not that everything in the book of Revelation is symbolic, although one might make a good case for that, but there's some things in there that are real, like the temple that was still standing in Revelation. And as a result of the temple still standing, we find that in chapter 11, that the temple was destroyed in AD 70, which gives you some indication that the book of Revelation was written before the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So if you're more interested in a topic like this, my book, Wars and Rumors of Wars, takes you through Matthew 24. Last Days Madness takes you through Matthew 24, plus a lot of other things that deal with the Antichrist, the man of lawlessness, the rapture, Daniel 70 weeks, etc. Covers a lot of ground, and you can get all of these at AmericanVision.org, AmericanVision.org.
Thanks for podcasting with Gary DeMar. Please subscribe and share this with anyone you think really needs to hear it.